Hey everyone! Welcome back to Story Hive. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an update. Let's jump into today's story. Crazy mother-in-law and father-in-law get arrested after attempting to trespass and get attacked by bees on our neighbor's property. I live in a very rural area on a small ranch that has been with my family since my grandfather. We are about 15 minutes from the nearest small town. When I say small, I really mean small. I met my wife by chance about 6 years ago when I stopped in town to pick up some groceries. She gave off a very tomboy vibe and had just come to the area herself. She had just finished school and found that she hated city life. I'll get to that later. I guess she saw me pull in with my pickup and some of the heavier equipment in it. She came over and asked what sort of livestock I had. She quickly cut to the chase. She was looking for work. She had experience with livestock and was new to the area. It is strange in our area to have single women looking for work as a ranch hand, but she said she could prove her worth. If I wasn't impressed, I was free to drive her back to town at the bus stop. I was looking for an extra hand for the upcoming months and was considering contacting my neighbor's boys for it, but figured I'd give her a shot. I'm glad I did too. She has one hell of a work ethic and was proactive about everything on the ranch. I let her stay in a guest room in the main house for the first week until she had enough pay for an apartment. But within 6 months, she moved back in. When we started dating 8 months later, we got married in a small ceremony with about 20 friends and family members. The only person from her family to show up was her uncle. Her uncle was a tank of a man even in his older years and had a sheep farm in Northern California. He and I talked shop a bit when he was there, and he was proud to give my wife away. I could see where she got her work ethic and knowledge of livestock from. However, there was one topic that my wife did not like to discuss: her birth parents. At first, all she would say was that there was bad blood between them. That was fine, we didn't know each other yet. But after the engagement, I wanted to know more about her and understand what exactly I was diving into. Her mother, the professor, worked at a college teaching a class I most likely. Her father, Phil, was, as my wife described, a weak man who did what the professor demanded. Some of the things my wife described about the professor sounded absurd and borderline insane. It included her trying to get my wife a girlfriend in middle school, insisting my wife was a lesbian. Now, my wife is a bit of a tomboy, there's no denying that, but she is also most definitely not a lesbian. There was a period when the professor wanted to live a natural lifestyle and asked Phil's brother to let them live on his farm. Within a week, my wife, on the other hand, felt like she had finally found something she liked and really connected with her uncle. My wife left home when she was 16 and lived with her uncle until she was 18. All the while, the professor kept threatening to drag her back. She never did. After my wife turned 18, she went to school, received a 4-year degree, and tried to work an office job but found it unfulfilling. She started taking the bus and working on jobs in rural areas, looking for something that fit what she was looking for. That was when our paths crossed. Last year, around March, we started getting mail addressed to the professor and Phil bills, bank statements and such. I found this strange and my wife wanted to trash it. I started marking them return to sender and no such occupant and dropped them right back into the mailbox. This came to a head in October when I was cleaning up the yard and a bright white SUV drove up with a U-Haul attached to it. My wife looked up and turned pale. "Oh God, it's them," she said. Out stepped a rotund woman and a thin man who only had a passing resemblance to her uncle. The professor immediately walked up to my wife. "Professor, well, let me have it look at you, it's been years." "Wife, Mom, what are you doing here?" "Professor, the university is doing virtual classes, and with COVID, we figured we could self-isolate at our ranch." She had a weird emphasis on my ranch. "Excuse me, "But this isn't your ranch." "Oh, I'm sure we can have the ownership all cleared up." "Well, aren't you going to invite us in?" "Ma'am, you may be my wife's mother, but you are a stranger to me. I would rather not." The professor turned to Phil. "Make the call." Phil instantly got on the phone with the police and started spinning a tale about us not letting them into the house that they equally own with us. I couldn't believe what I was hearing and how insane it was being spun. Luckily, as I said before, it's a small town. The sheriff pulled up, and it was someone I knew from most of my life. Sheriff really embodies the mindset of a small town constable. He tries to be a peacemaker and peacekeeper first and foremost. He also knew that this land was in my family's name for 3 generations. "Sheriff, what's this I hear about you selling half your ranch, Duke?" "Me, I didn't. These are my wife's parents, and they think they have a legal stake in my land." "Professor, not think, no. We've lived here since February, with tenant laws. That means—" "Sheriff, funny, I don't remember you in town." That shut the professor right up for a second. But then she reached in her bag and pulled out a stack of letters bills and bank statements with our ranch's address. "Professor, then how do you explain these?" The sheriff took the letters and looked at them. "Ma'am, these are all marked return to sender." The professor turned desperate. "Please, I haven't seen my daughter in years. I just want to make sure she's okay. Surely you can see that." She pointed to me. "Is he controlling her every move?" The sheriff rolled his eyes and walked over to talk to my wife and me again. Sheriff likes to solve problems between people, and he hasn't encountered this level of crazy before. "You might just want to invite them in for coffee and talk for a few minutes." "Wife, they are your parents." "Wife, if you leave them here, you will just have to come back in 5 minutes to handle an assault." "Sheriff, you can't mean that they're your family." "Look, I'm just going to head up the road, invite them in, and talk to them." My wife got a bit of an angry glint in her eye. "Does this mean you're going to invite your cousin Aaron to Thanksgiving?" Sheriff's cousin Aaron was currently serving 8 years for a multitude of felonies. Sheriff's entire family considers him the family shame. With that statement, the look in Sheriff's eyes changed. He gave my wife a look like "that bad hung," and my wife merely nodded. Sheriff turned back to the professor and Phil. "All right, they don't want you here, best you not come back." The two protested briefly, but then piled back into the SUV and drove off, with Sheriff trailing right behind to make sure they were completely off the property. This was the first time I met the professor and Phil, but it definitely stuck with me. I detailed earlier how my wife's mother, the professor, tried a strange attempt to seize control of our ranch back in October. In December, it got crazier. Keep in mind, we live in a smaller town about an hour away from a major city. Our ranch is about 15 minutes from town by farm road, just to give you a lay of the land. I stopped into town to get some supplies, and by the time I was done packing up the truck, this time she actually acted cordial. I chose to be curt. She basically begged me to at least listen to her for 5 minutes in the local cafe. I didn't want to create a scene on Main Street, so I agreed. We sat, and the professor talked. She claimed my wife was always confused about who she was, and that the professor and Phil had only her best interests in mind. I didn't want to yell, shout, accuse, or throw anything back in her face. I was just waiting out the clock. She said, "My wife saw you coming and wedged herself into my life." At that I did push back. I said that I felt I was blessed to have her in my life. Oh boy, those were the wrong words to use with this woman. "Professor, what do you mean blessed?" "Duke's pardon. You just said blessed." I put my head in my hands and just wished this was over. Everyone in the cafe was looking at the two of us. The professor really projected her voice with the last sentence. "Dukes, ma'am, if you're trying to win me over, you might as well just stop." I ended up cutting the conversation short. She couldn't keep her act up in public, and people in the cafe started watching more closely. The sheriff showed up as I was leaving, and I went straight home, making sure to lock all the doors and set the alarms. Come January, I had a strange feeling about what the professor and Phil might do next. My wife seemed to have a hunch as well. At this point, my wife had been harassed by her mother several more times. I'd mostly been spared, but knew of their calls and how they always hung up once I answered. On January 15th, I woke up to find that our dog was barking incessantly. It was strange because our dog isn't normally a barker. I grabbed my shotgun and went outside to see what was happening. I saw the same bright white SUV parked at our neighbor's ranch across the street. The ranch had a 2.5-mile perimeter fenced off by barbed wire. Our neighbor had a small chicken farm, and we would sometimes help each other out if we needed it. As I started walking over, I saw the professor and Phil both struggling to climb the barbed wire fence. I was shocked. The professor had decided to try her hand at being a rancher for a day. She had even brought a bunch of things with her. They had been spotted climbing the fence by the neighbor's bees. Our neighbor kept about 10 hives along the north side of his property. The bees were not pleased by the trespassing, and once the professor and Phil finally climbed the fence and stepped into the property, the bees swarmed them. I heard their screams as they got stung multiple times. Our neighbor finally showed up with a netted suit to chase the bees back and help the professor and Phil out. He wasn't exactly pleased to see them either. The sheriff ended up coming back to handle the situation, and the professor and Phil were given a ticket for trespassing. They tried to argue that they were just looking for my wife. They had to get medical attention for the bee stings, and they looked ridiculous. They stayed in town for about 3 days after that, but eventually they packed up and left. I think the embarrassment of the whole ordeal finally got to them, and they moved away. My wife and I found it a bit amusing, though it was stressful at the time. We could only hope that they wouldn't try any more crazy schemes. They haven't bothered us since. The drama with the professor and Phil eventually died down, but it had left a lingering unease in the back of our minds. Despite their departure, we still received the occasional random letter or strange phone call. Most of it was just junk mail or automated messages, but it served as a reminder of the chaos they had stirred up. We took the opportunity to reinforce our security, installing better locks and adding cameras around the property. We also decided to add a new layer of fencing around the perimeter, not just for security, but to keep curious passersby from getting too close. In the months that followed, we settled back into our routine. Life on the ranch returned to its usual rhythm. My wife and I continued to enjoy our work and each other's company, and we made sure to stay involved in the local community. The neighbors were supportive and understanding, and it felt good to know we had their backing. One of the silver linings of the whole ordeal was that it brought my wife and me closer together. We had weathered a storm together and emerged stronger for it. We often laughed about the absurdity of the situation and how the professor and Phil had ended up in such a ridiculous predicament. We continued to help our neighbor with his chickens and even expanded our own livestock. Our ranch thrived, and we found joy in the little things, whether it was a successful calving season or just a peaceful evening watching the sunset over the fields. Occasionally, someone would ask us about the crazy story of the professor and Phil. We'd share the tale with a mix of disbelief and humor, and it always ended with a good laugh. It became a part of our story, a testament to the resilience and adaptability that life on the ranch had taught us. As time went on, the memory of the professor and Phil became more of a strange chapter in our lives rather than a source of ongoing stress. We focused on what mattered most: our work, our home, and each other. The ranch was our sanctuary, and we were content knowing that it was finally a place of peace and stability. And so, with the past behind us and a future full of possibilities ahead, we continued to build our lives together one day at a time. Thanks for tuning in to today's Reddit story. If you enjoyed it, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out on more amazing stories. See you next time.